stress of our world can take a toll on our physical and emotional health. Here, in New York's Catskill Mountains, lies a luxurious place of healing called WION Wellness Center. The WION Wellness Center provides 500,000 square feet of natural methods to manage diabetes, hypertension, chronic pain, obesity, depression, anxiety, and other conditions. We use the traditions of centuries-old natural science from India, yoga, Ayurveda, acupuncture, and naturopathy in personalized programs that help you take charge of your own health. A minimum 5-day stay is recommended for best results. Book now at yo1.com.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Gravitas with me, Mohammed Saleh, and let's start the show. On the cover story tonight, we'll tell you why the banking stocks globally are in a bit of a tizzy. The question that each one of you is asking is this: are your investments safe? Are your life savings safe? The financial upheavals that began with the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in the United States of America are now shaking the foundations of other global banks with weak and dodgy accounting and regulatory records. This is the 4S crisis of the banking world. The Switzerland's second largest bank, Credit Suisse, is in all kinds of trouble. Its woes, remember, are not directly linked to the collapse of the banks in the United States of America. Its woes are actually more about poor regulation, of money laundering accusations, of scandals, and investors finally deciding to pull the plug on it. But Credit Suisse has managed to get a $54 billion lifeline from the Swiss central bank. But the question, of course, is, will this be enough to save the Swiss banking giant? And also on the show tonight, we'll be telling you as to why the state of Israel has erupted with some of the biggest protests that it has witnessed in its history. The Israeli president has in fact warned that the country is now hurtling towards a civil war. But what has gone wrong, and why is Bibi Netanyahu so adamant for pushing through with his controversial judicial changes? This is a pivotal moment in the history of the state of Israel. Nearly 5% of its population is out on the streets protesting. Meanwhile, the United States of America has promised to do whatever it can to help Ukraine to fight back against Russia. But what happens if Kiev starts to lose the war? Does Washington have a plan B for Ukraine? As the downing of the deadly MQ-9 Reaper drone has now shown that it's only a whisker which separates the two nuclear behemoths from having a go at each other. We'll also be telling you about the battle of the AI which is heating up, and China's chatbot Ernie, developed by Baidu, has in fact failed to impress the investors, resulting in Baidu's shares plunging by as much as 10%. Is China falling behind in the AI race? And there's also now a new entrant into the elite business of space tourism. India's Space Research Organization has announced its plans to start sending common people into space as tourists by the year 2030. Now, there are at this moment just a handful of other players in this sector, but ISRO, of course, hold the edge. And we'll tell you why in just a bit. All right, now this, of course, is the big story tonight, and it is about a financial upheaval that has gripped Switzerland. Switzerland, remember, is the capital of the banking world. But this is a title that it may lose soon, courtesy Credit Suisse. This is the second largest bank of Switzerland, once the pride of the Swiss banking industry. But now it's a national embarrassment for the Swiss people. And here's why we say this. On Wednesday, the shares of the bank tumbled by as much as 25%. They fell to a record low of 1.56 Swiss francs per share. This development is, of course, very distressing for every shareholder, because not since the financial crisis of 2008 has a Swiss lender faced this kind of turmoil. What explains this, and why is Credit Suisse in this kind of a crisis? And also, what does it mean for you, an investor in your bank? What could be the consequences, not just for Credit Suisse, but also, will there be a ripple effect? Now, I ask these questions because this is an interconnected world, and no ripple stops at just one point, because banks, as they say, have no barriers. This may or may not become 2008, because the governments are at this time, one expects, a bit smarter. But if they are staving off today's crisis, the governments are also using other banks as a front in order to create an artificial barrier. A huge financial storm is at this moment raging, and no one can camouflage this. And this storm can hit you, and in the next few minutes we'll tell you how. But first, let's try and understand as to what's happening. The crisis at Credit Suisse has been in the making for quite some time now. This is not something that has happened overnight, and this is not something that Credit Suisse can blame on what is happening in the United States of America. This is a crisis that's been brewing for the last several years. Credit Suisse has been caught in one controversy after another. So let's give you a timeline of the events, and let's start with what the bank is presently facing. It is facing a criminal conviction for allegedly helping drug dealers launder money in Bulgaria. Now, secondly, this bank is also entangled in a corruption case in Mozambique. Now, thirdly, there is a spying scandal that involves a former employee and an executive. Fourthly, Credit Suisse is also involved in a massive leak of client data to the media. Fifthly, the bank's association with the disgraced financier Lex Greensill, and also with the now failed New York-based investment firm Archegos Capital. These five factors have played a massive role in leading Credit Suisse into the current mess that it finds itself in. These incidents have clearly portrayed the bank as an institution that hasn't had a grip on its affairs. This, over the course of the last 2 years, has triggered huge client outflows in late 2022, because remember, from 2021 onwards, the value of this bank has fallen by a staggering 85%. And people have been making a bank run to try and get their money out. The bank is, of course, trying to woo its customers back, but a development last week has sent its efforts down the drain. No prizes for guessing as to what we are talking about. We are talking about the collapse of the three American banks last week: the Silicon Valley Bank, the Silvergate Bank, and also the Signature Bank. Now, in a matter of 7 days, these three important and pretty big banks in America shut down. The first two ran out of customers, and the third ran out of money. Their fall has quite obviously spooked the global investors, and they have begun ditching any bank that smells of risk, and have now started withdrawing their money in piles, which is what has led to the collapse of the banking stocks globally. Now, Credit Suisse happens to be one of those banks with poor, shaky foundations and regulatory record that has been badly hit by the ripples that originated in the United States, resulting in a crisis that is now being talked about as the crisis of the 4S. On the 15th of March, its largest shareholder, the Saudi National Bank, has ruled out further investment, meaning that it has refused to provide any more cash to Credit Suisse. Now, the bank's chairman has said that it had already done enough, and now it's unlikely to pitch in more support for Credit Suisse. For the unversed, in October last year, the Saudi National Bank had invested a staggering $1.5 billion in Credit Suisse. This investment amounted to a stake of nearly about 9.9%. In return, the Saudis asked Credit Suisse to deliver a swift overhaul to live up to its reputation of being a 160-year-old institution that had the people's trust. But Credit Suisse simply could not keep up to its promise. It simply could not manage its internal affairs. And this is what has led to its fall from grace. So now you know what has happened. You also know as to how it has happened. And you also know as to why it has happened. But the question that should worry you is as to what happens next. Will this now result in a global banking crisis? Could other banks now be next in line to fall? If yes, what could be done to turn the situation around? So let's take each of these propositions one at a time. The first question, should you be worried? Yes, you should be. Because you see, immediately after the shares of the Credit Suisse tumbled, stocks in many European and American banks have also plunged as customers have started to pull their money out. And it's obvious that is what they'll do. The numbers will tell you the story. First Republic Bank has sunk by 7.7%. Huntington Bank shares have gone down by 5.7%. JP Morgan is down by about 5.5%. If we speak about the markets, Dow Jones Industrial Average has fallen by about 1.5% and Nasdaq has also fallen by about 1.2%. Standard & Poor's is down as well. But if you look at the banking-specific stocks, then the fall is much sharper. The reason for these falls is obvious. It is the fear of the crisis spilling over and engulfing many of these big banks. So how do we perceive this? Will this panic die down or will it snowball into something much bigger? At this moment, no one anywhere in the world, not even the top bankers, know as to where this rot would actually lead us to. Because it is not clear as to how many of these big financial institutions around the world have an exposure to these assets that simply mean nothing. But let me take you back in time. And it's not that long ago, it is 15 years ago. The year was 2008. A bank filed for bankruptcy. Its name was the Lehman Brothers. This was the fourth largest investment bank in America. It had $639 billion in terms of assets and $613 billion in terms of liabilities. And naturally, it just could not bridge the gap and it fell. And the collapse had a domino effect of sorts. It resulted in a financial meltdown that swept through the markets one by one. And investors started ditching the risky banks. This triggered what we now remember with a lot of pain in the past as the 2008 financial crisis. So are we witnessing a rerun of the 2008 mess? Is this going to be another Lehman Brothers moment? Well, the answer is both yes and no, because in a matter of the last 10 days, 4 banks have hit rock bottom. 3 have completely collapsed. The fourth one, the Swiss bank, is just about hanging on. It has got a new influx, a $54 billion bailout by the central bank in Switzerland, but it's difficult to predict whether Credit Suisse can still turn things around for itself. The analysts are issuing some pretty grim warnings, realizing that the risks that the banks face are pretty severe. But that said, not every bank is in a bad shape. There are big giants that simply haven't been touched by this crisis. Now, there are institutions such as the Bank of America, JP Morgan and Citibank that seem to have fared way better in this crisis over the course of the last 10 days. In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, they had introduced annual stress testing to check whether they can withstand severe economic shocks, and they seem to have enough capital to ensure that they don't fall, even if customers start withdrawing their deposits. And till the time they remain standing, at this moment, it looks like another financial crisis has happened in 2008. At this point of time, may not happen. But then, as they say, with money, never say never. All of this is still a possibility. Nothing is guaranteed. And as they say, it's only when the tide goes down that you actually learn as to who's been swimming naked. The crisis of the forays is a serious warning, and it is again exposed that the reason why banks fail, taking down the lifetime savings of millions of people with them, is that the greed and criminality of a few lacks auditing and poor government regulation. That is at the heart of what leads to many of these banks to acquire assets that simply are not assets anymore. Let's now shift our attention to the state of Israel, and this is a question that a lot of people are now asking, including the Israeli president. Will there be a civil war in Israel? Now, I'm not saying this because the country's own president has warned about Israel now hurtling towards a civil war. Now, before we tell you more about the serious crisis that has gripped Israel, listen in to what the Israeli president had to say.
Whoever thinks that a true civil war where human life is at stake is a border we won't reach has no clue. Specifically now in the 75th year of the State of Israel, the abyss is at arm's reach.
So what did the Israeli president mean? What is the Israeli president warning about? Let's try and explain. Now, Israel has been reeling with chaos for the last few days. The country has a population of about 9 million people. To put this in perspective, the population of the state of Israel is less than the population of India's national capital, New Delhi. But 5% of the entire Israeli population is out on the streets. People are protesting against the Prime Minister Netanyahu's judicial changes. These judicial changes will seriously undermine the powers of the Israeli Supreme Court. They in fact restrict the judiciary's freedom to adjudicate the actions of the executive on serious constitutional matters. What the judicial changes in fact intend to do is to overhaul the country's legal system and to turn the Israeli judiciary to be subservient to the executive arm of the government. Now, these are questions that the Israelis are asking, and these are questions for which they don't seem to be getting an answer from their Prime Minister. In which democracy is it okay or acceptable to turn the judiciary subservient to the executive? What happens to the principle of the separation of powers in a government? With the judiciary's back broken, who can then keep a check on executive's power? Benjamin Netanyahu, with his judicial changes, wants to do just this, to break the Israeli judiciary's back, and the Israeli people are not happy with this. They've demonstrated in and around the Ben Gurion International Airport. Protesters also tried to disrupt Netanyahu's flight to Germany. Imagine a situation where the sitting Prime Minister is not even able to drive to the airport in a sitting. Now, the people in Israel are calling Benjamin Netanyahu a dictator. Netanyahu's flight was supposed to take off at 5 p.m., but it was delayed till 10 in the night. Now, look at these visuals. Jerusalem, in fact, woke up to the sight of a long red line. The protesters painted it along the roads leading to Israel's Supreme Court. And this was after President Herzog, in fact, said that a civil war is a red line in a televised address to the nation. Now, the Israeli president wants a compromise to try and resolve this conflict around the judicial changes. He's also unveiled some alternative changes to the judiciary, but Netanyahu has stuck to his guns. He's turned down this compromise. He said that the coalition representatives will not agree with the president's proposal. So what else were the Israelis expecting? Now, the country hasn't had a functioning government in the last 4 years. Netanyahu has been Israel's premier for a total of 15 years. He's made a dramatic comeback just last December. He's been in office for over 3 months now, but the country's political crisis is just getting worse. The centrist parties, remember, refused to serve with Netanyahu. He's also facing serious allegations of corruption. Now, Netanyahu was able to form a government, a coalition government, only by allying himself with the far-right religious parties of his nation. This is the most far-right-wing government that the state of Israel has seen. The people voted for it when they chose Netanyahu, but the decision has, of course, come back to bite them. The administration is hammering the democratic institutions. The legal system in the state of Israel is presently under threat. The Israelis have caught their prime minister's bluff. Hundreds and thousands of them are taking to the streets. The protest The protesters launched a day of resistance on Thursday. They flocked the streets of the ultra-Orthodox city of Bani Barak. They tried to erect a mock military recruit station. The demonstrations have also spread to different locations. The former Navy men tried to block the docking lanes at the Haifa port. Roads were blocked around the commercial hub Tel Aviv. And our correspondent, Jody Cohen, in fact, has sent us this report from the ground about the situation that now prevails in the state of Israel.
I'm standing in the heart of the Hashalom interchange, the major thoroughfare in Tel Aviv, where protesters in coordination with the police have taken to the streets. Now behind me is a religious group that have come together to protest, to sing about unity and for brotherhood and for a compromise solution. Now this comes as Prime Minister Netanyahu has rejected President Herzog's proposed compromise framework. The opposition leaders have expressed some cautious approval for this framework as a basis for talks and criticised the government for so quickly dismissing it.
You see, the people of Israel have a very powerful history of tradition. They fought hard to bring their country into existence, and it didn't happen easily. The first kibbutz community was in fact formed almost about a century ago. People operated under a premise that all income generated went into a common pool. They considered themselves to be part of a unit larger than their own families. And now, what Netanyahu is threatening to do is to break the democratic institutions as they exist in the country. He's calling them reforms, but these judicial changes will go a long way in effectively in breaking the back of the Israeli judiciary as it exists. The Israeli people view this as an attempt to trample on the pillars of democracy. The people are raising their voice. They're trying to push back against the judicial overhaul. But the question is, why didn't Netanyahu, the longest-serving Prime Minister of the State of Israel, see this coming? Now, extreme right and religious politicians are in the office, and with a lying and an extremely corrupt leader, what did the Israeli people, of course, expect to begin with? And the question is this: is there now a way out of this deadlock for the Israeli people? Because as things stand, there does not appear to be an easy solution unless Netanyahu is willing to listen to the voice of his people. But will he, is the question. Let's now shift our attention to what is happening in Ukraine. Last night on the show, we asked you a question. Has America finally joined Ukraine's war? We told you the reason: the downing of the American drone in the Black Sea. It was struck by a Russian jet for flying very close to Crimea. This episode that has in fact unfolded in the last 48 hours is very striking, and we ask this question. An American drone which has strike capabilities, which America has used to carry out some very high-profile strikes, if that is found close to the battle zone, the question is obvious: has America now officially joined the war? If it has become an active participant in this conflict? And tonight, there are these questions that are being echoed in Europe as well. Courtesy Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist, the same journalist who in fact clearly pointed his finger towards the United States of America for carrying out the bombings that sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines. He's now made another stunning claim. And what Seymour Hersh now says is that America has a plan B for Ukraine war, a plan B. Remember, this war is now into more than a year, and we're now talking about what America's plan B is for what is unfolding in Ukraine. And the plan B for the Americans will kick in the minute the Americans realize that Kiev may actually lose this war. So what exactly is this plan? Directly delving into the war, directly fighting the Russians. Because if Ukrainians begin to lose, then the only option that the Americans in fact will have is to go into the battlefield themselves. And this is what is in fact told an American NGO recently. Allow me to quote Seymour Hersh's exact words. This is what he said: "I am told that the game is going to be this. This is NATO. We are supporting NATO in offensive operations against the Russians, which is not going to fool the world. It is us fighting Russia. This, remember, is a sensational claim. The question is, what made Seymour Hersh to say this? Why does he think that Americans in fact have a plan B? The Joe Biden administration, which has been at great pains to try and assure the Ukrainian people that America will do everything it can to fight off the Russians, why does Seymour Hersh now say that America's plan B is to in fact fight the Russians directly? Now, Hersh says that this is not something that he's deduced, but he in fact has some solid inputs that he's received from his friends within the American administration. He's also pointed at certain recent developments that have taken place to justify his claims, developments such as these. America's decision to dispatch its 82nd and 101st Elite Airborne Divisions close to the Ukrainian border. Now, for the unversed, in October last year, America in fact deployed its 101st unit just miles away from Ukraine's borders, and this happened for the very first time in nearly about 80 long years. And the decision is, of course, of a modular infantry division that is particularly trained for air assault missions. Now, Hersh says that this isn't just posturing by the Americans. This division is being trained to fight the war if the need were to arise. If the Ukrainians were begin to crack against the Russians, then the Americans are likely to move in. So what do these remarks in fact mean? Is there any merit to the claims that are being made here? Well, let's go by Hersh's track record. There is little reason to doubt his claims, more so given as to how he's not the only one who's saying this. Last week, a similar statement was also made by Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And he said that the West is mulling on sending allied troops into Ukraine. Now, allow me to quote his exact statement. I think we are very close to suggesting in all seriousness that the soldiers of Ukraine's allied countries may cross the border and enter into the territory of Ukraine. The world has never been so close, so that from a local war, after all, it was about Luhansk and Donetsk, a world war would turn out. The likelihood of this is, of course, growing from day to day. Let's also take a look at this headline. The Global Times has carried it recently. It said that the danger of another world war in Europe is increasing. The NATO, led by the United States, is ready for direct confrontation with the Russians. To add muscle to its claims, it's also mentioned a statement by the chair of NATO's military committee, Rob Bauer. In the month of January earlier this year, Rob Bauer said that NATO is ready. This is what he said. NATO is ready for a direct confrontation with Russia if the need were to arise. He also highlighted as to how NATO had started moving its battle groups along the Eastern Front and how it had also created 4 more battle groups following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He said that these groups will fight the Russians directly if another red line is crossed. Listen to those words. These troops will fight the Russians directly if another red line is crossed. To put it simply, what Seymour Hersh has said isn't really a make-believe story. It's rooted in claims and statements that have been made by Western leaders and also the leaders of the NATO military alliance. It is rooted in the discrete actions of the US Army and also of the NATO forces, and also in the assessments that have been made by Russia and its ally China. So is Russia preparing to in fact meddle in the Ukraine war? Now, is the United States preparing to meddle in the Ukraine war? Now, if we go by America's track record, the countless wars that it has waged globally, it won't come as a surprise if it actually does get involved in the war. After all, the American defense machinery is reaping billions of dollars with this war. And it's not just about Ukraine, it's also about money. And it's also about the money which the American defense industrial complex, of course, has been making with the fighting that is ongoing in Ukraine. Because if you were to put 2 and 2 together, with what Joe Biden has been saying, and also in the manner that the American troops and the NATO troops are being positioned in Europe, it is fairly easy to see as to things are in fact heading into a direction where if Ukraine, if its defenses were to crumble, then the United States' only option will be to go in to assist the Ukrainian troops. All right, this is of course a question that I'm pretty sure that each one of you would be mulling upon. Where do you want to go on your next holiday? Do you want to go to Paris, the city of love, or to Dubai for some binge shopping, or to one of the Nordic nations to watch some enchanting northern lights? Now, almost pretty much every destination on planet Earth is soon likely to become passé, because now we are entering into a decade of space travel, and India is entering into this race of space tourism in a pretty big way. Now, keep in mind that this is not going to be an easy market to crack. There are companies such as SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, who are promising their customers with the experience of a lifetime. And India's Space Research Organization is the latest entrant into this space tourism race. But how much do you think this is going to cost you to in fact buy a ticket to go into space? According to ISRO, one ticket to go into space will cost you a cool 6 crore Indian rupees. That's about 700,000 American dollars. And if you can set aside this kind of money, then deep space could be your next holiday destination. Take a look.
How is India planning to put the layman in space? The Indian Space Research Organization is partnering with private firms to create a space travel module. India is also putting special attention into the safety of the space trip. ISRO has produced what have been described as reusable launch vehicle technology demonstrators to gain more knowledge on safety of space flights. So how can you get a ticket to space? Well, all you need is about $700,000 in your pocket. Yes, you heard me right. ISRO will sell its space ticket for about $700,000, which it says is a competitive price in the global market. There's another upside to paying the large bucks. ISRO will certify the people as legitimate astronauts once they finish the trip to space. But let's be honest, this is not the first time that you have heard of a company taking civilians on a space trip. Let's talk about one of ISRO's biggest rivals, SpaceX.
Go crew 5.
Business magnate Elon Musk's SpaceX aims to colonize Mars and create a monopoly in the space industry.
Vehicle is pitching downrange.
But it's the new kid in the block compared to ISRO. India's premier space agency is an experienced player in the field of space exploration and has been launching rockets since 1975. SpaceX launched its first mission in 2010 and thus has some catching up to do. But let's talk about money. Both the space agencies are poles apart in terms of cost per mission. SpaceX's Falcon 9 launch vehicle's cost per launch came up to $62 million. On the other hand, ISRO's Polar satellite launch vehicle demanded only $15 million per launch. This might seem like peanuts compared to SpaceX's high-priced launches. But why stop there? Between 2013 and 2015, ISRO charged an average of $3 million per satellite launch. This might not come as a shock, but SpaceX's each satellite launch cost up to $60 million. Despite India's premier space agency beating SpaceX from various angles, Elon Musk has not shied away from acknowledging how he is impressed by India's frugal methods of conducting successful launch missions. This admiration came after India broke a world record by launching 104 satellites into space using a single rocket. India still holds the world record since 2021, but it's not only Musk who praises ISRO's frugal methods. Indian Prime Minister Modi saluted ISRO's Mangalyaan mission, which had reached Mars with a smaller budget than a Hollywood movie. India's Prime Minister also pointed out that the per-kilometer cost of India's Mangalyaan mission as it zoomed through deep space was cheaper than the average cost per kilometer of an auto rickshaw ride in India. So what does India have in store for its future space missions? ISRO is planning its first maiden human spaceflight, known as the Gaganyaan mission. The mission's launch was delayed due to the COVID pandemic, but looks like things are back on track, with astronauts already being trained for the mission, and crew evaluation and assessment activities in progress. So make sure you save up some money as we slowly approach the year 2030. Who knows, maybe you could take a trip to space.
Meanwhile, a new set of military drills are taking place in the Gulf of Oman. Any guesses as to who could be staging these drills? Well, it might not come as a surprise because it is China, Russia and Iran who are taking part in these drills that could potentially raise tensions with the US. What China calls an exercise to deepen cooperation between the participating countries' navies could well be a retaliatory move towards the United States as economic and security issues continue to rise between the two. But what are these joint drills all about? The Security Belt 2023 Joint Maritime Military Exercise is a development of the earlier two drills that were held in 2019 and 2022. The three countries, in fact, wish to demonstrate their capacity in safeguarding maritime security in the Gulf of Oman. The Chinese PLA has also sent a guided missile destroyer called Nanning to the exercises. The United States, for its part, has been trying to take a pretty safe stance. It has said that it is not concerned about the training exercise. Now, that makes sense because this is not the first time that the countries are training together. The US National Security Council has also emphasized that it will try and make sure that there is no threat to the nation's security and that of its allies. Talking about allies, let's take the country which is far from being US's ally, the most heavily sanctioned nation among the three, Russia. While the United States continues to punish the country by imposing economic sanctions, China, on the other hand, is also deepening ties with Moscow. This raises a question: could this lead to China's potential willingness to offer military aid to Vladimir Putin? The United States, remember, has done no favors to try and win China onto its side because there's been a furious trade war that the United States has waged against China, besides the contain China policy that the United States has resorted to for more than a decade and a half. Now, China has raised a lot of eyebrows as it goes to help Moscow economically by rejecting the G7's price cap on oil, and is now also extending its hand in support for a healthier relationship with Moscow with these military drills. And there's more. The Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russia's Vladimir Putin caught up over a phone call. And this was around New Year's Eve. The two sides released statements saying that the ties between the two are at their historic best. And what's more, Vladimir Putin also said that he's expecting a state visit from Xi Jinping pretty soon. He said, and I quote him here, "We're expecting you, dear friend," was the message from Moscow. But do not be mistaken, China is not the only one that is partnering with Russia. The case is pretty much similar with Iran. Tehran is still purchasing Russian oil and is sending military aid to Moscow in return. This is true. This has been going on for the last 1 year. Tehran has sent many kamikaze drones, and if reports are to be believed, then it is also just sending ballistic missiles to Russia for Russia to use in the war since October. The friendship between the three nations seems to be getting stronger, as leaders have been seen very frequently flying to each other's capitals. In July last year, the Russian president went to Tehran. He met with his counterpart Ibrahim Raisi and discussed the issue of strengthening bilateral ties. And then, in November, a group of Russian security officials visited Iran. The aim was to try and find ways to counter the Western pressure on both these nations. In the latest, China also hosted bilateral talks with Iran, in which they landed on an agreement to try and restore relations after 7 years of tensions, and this may have disturbed the United States as it has strained ties with Iran since the founding of the Islamic Republic, when Iran had in fact taken several US diplomats as hostages. Amidst all the tension between the United States and the other three, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping at this moment appears to be pretty buoyant as he's now entered into his third term. Xi has recently called the United States as a big threat to China's growth. He did not just stop there. He blamed the Biden administration for leading a campaign of suppression against China's troubles. Right now, what we are witnessing are the third set of military drills between China, Russia and Iran. While the United States has been trying to isolate each of these three nations individually, what we are witnessing is perhaps the birth of a new triangular alliance in Asia, which will go a long way in shaping America's diplomacy in this part of the world, and has also in many ways turned American efforts to isolate these nations completely hollow. Let me now show you a headline. The Newark mayor signs a deal with a nation that does not exist. Basically, the city of Newark recently got conned. By whom? A man who is a history sheeter in the art of conning. Meet Nithyananda. He's a self-styled conman. He was not just conned, he's not just conned an American city, but he's also conned India and the United States as well. His story is as bizarre as it gets. So let's begin in the years 1997 to 1977 to 78. It's in either of these years that Nithyananda claims that he was born, where in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. His actual name is Rajasekharan. The man says that he began practicing yoga at the age of 3. Sometime around the age of 12, he claims to have achieved enlightenment. So what happened next? Months passed and so did years. And somewhere in between, Rajasekharan turned into Swami Nithyananda. A self-styled godman, Nithyananda set up ashrams and his followers grew. In 2018, Nithyananda made headlines when he was accused of raping a disciple for over 5 years. He was arrested and then given bail. And once Nithyananda was out on bail, he disappeared, only to resurface in 2020 to announce a country called Kailasa. We still do not know as to where he lives. We still do not know where Kailasa is, although he claims it is on an island of Ecuador. But what is interesting is that the Ecuadorian government says that it has no record of any Nithyananda living anywhere close to its islands. But what is interesting is that Nithyananda's Twitter account says California. Turns out that the godman had in fact bought an island somewhere near South America, and at this point of time no one even knows whether he's on an island of Ecuador or in a different part of the world. Now, it's not certain as to where he has his following, but it is perfectly possible that he's even duped his followers. This crook then set up a bank in that island. He appointed so-called ambassadors. He put together a funny-looking website and branded the arrangement as a country. It goes without saying that no one was believing him, but bizarre hit a new high when Kailasa was given a platform in the United Nations. It happened late in February, and this woman, who claims to be the permanent representative of Kailasa, addressed the assembly looking like she was straight out of a drama set. So how did Kailasa get a ticket to enter the United Nations, let alone a seat? How did the United Nations buy the story of an imagined nation, one that exists only on a website, and that too in hard fact is very hard to verify? After fooling India and the United Nations, Nithyananda in fact went for the Arab world. One of his representatives has now just yesterday, met with a diplomat of the United Arab Emirates. Under what pretext? The next target is, of course, the wild, wild west, the city of Newark. Its mayor, believe it or not, the mayor of the city of Newark, Ras Baraka, invited a delegation from Kailasa. He wanted the fictional country to join into a sister city partnership. A ceremony was held, niceties were exchanged, a deal was also signed. The agreement lasted for about 6 days before the authorities recognized the sham that they had got into. I thought the basic thing that people do these days is to just Google. Clearly, we have exceptions here, including the United Nations, the city of Newark, and also the ambassador of the United Arab Emirates. Either Nithyananda and his sham of a country are having a great run, or it's actually very easy to fool people these days. Either way, what we know is that there are movie script writers who would be watching for ideas very closely, and this, of course, will make for a great pot boiler. Let's also now take a look at the global headlines at this moment.
Malawi's President Lazarus Chakwera visited victims of Cyclone Freddy in the hospital, as the country has reported 225 deaths with hundreds injured and some people still missing. Chakwera declared 14 days of national mourning and has called for international support for relief efforts. He said more than 80,000 people were displaced. The tropical storm Freddy has killed about 27 people in Madagascar and Mozambique before lashing Mozambique a second time. The total death toll has surpassed 300. Clashes broke out at a rally of thousands in Athens after Greek workers struck to protest what they said were neglected safety standards that led to the deadliest train crash in the country's history. Youth fired petrol bombs and stones at police who responded with volleys of tear gas outside Parliament, sending crowds running. A farmers' protest party has shaken up the political landscape in the Netherlands, emerging as the big winner in provincial elections that determined the makeup of the Senate. The BBB party rode a wave of protests against the government's environmental policies and looks set to have won more Senate seats than Prime Minister Mark Rutte's conservative VVD party. Finnish Lapland was treated to an aurora show with northern lights in different shapes and colors lighting up the sky on Wednesday night. Green, yellow, white, purple, and the rarer red auroras could be seen throughout the night. The auroras seen over the skies of Rovaniemi at the Arctic Circle are said to be the best display so far in 2023. Police and demonstrators clashed again in Senegal's capital Dakar on Thursday ahead of a court case involving opposition leader and presidential aspirant Ousmane Sonko, who has gained widespread support among much of the country's youth. Police fired tear gas at hundreds of Sonko supporters as they trailed vehicles taking him to court for the resumption of a libel case against him. Parliamentary elections in Kazakhstan on Sunday are likely to usher in a lower house loyal to President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, analysts said, which should help him consolidate his position a year after he removed the country's veteran leader. The lower house of parliament, the Mazilis, was elected in 2021 when former leader Nursultan Nazarbayev was still in power as head of the ruling Nur Otan party, which predictably swept the vote. A hotel in a southern English town that was reportedly housing Ukrainian refugees had to be evacuated when it went up in flames on Thursday morning. Eyewitness video showed a huge fire ripping through the 400-year-old Angel Inn in Midhurst, West Sussex, and the building next door. The hotel on North Street was housing Ukrainian refugees at the time of the fire. Britain is set to announce a ban on TikTok on government phones on Thursday, PA Media reported.
We take the security of government devices very seriously, and in particular, the installation and use of TikTok.
A move that would follow other Western countries who have barred the Chinese-owned video app over security concerns. TikTok has come under increasing scrutiny due to fears that user data from the app owned by Beijing-based company ByteDance could end up in the hands of the Chinese government, undermining Western security interests. Swiss-Italian lawyer Gianni Infantino has been re-elected as the president of World Football's governing body for another 4 years. The 52-year-old ran unopposed and has promised the member nations a record revenue of $11 billion in the next cycle leading up to the 2026 World Cup in North America. Australian Open champion Aryna Sabalenka's near-perfect start to the season continues with the Belarusian storming into the semi-finals at Indian Wells after a dominant win over home favourite Coco Gauff. In the men's draw, former world number 1 Daniil Medvedev also reached the semis for the first time after beating Spain's Alejandro Davidovich Fogena to notch up an 18th straight win on the tour.
Well, that's all the time we have in this edition of Gravitas. We'll leave you with Gravitas images. Have a good night.
ढला ना हो रंगों में वो क्या बचपन है, जो झूमे ना उमंगों में वो क्या बचपन है। बचपन जिंदगी में सिर्फ एक बार आता है, उसे खुल के जीने दो, दाग लगने दो। दीवारों पर लगा है ना बर्जर इजी क्लीन पेंट, इसके क्रॉस लिंकिंग पॉलीमर से नो दाग नो धब्बा, ओनली ब्यूटीफुल वॉल्स। बचपन जिंदगी में सिर्फ एक बार आता है, उसे खुल के जीने दो, दाग लगने दो। दीवारों पर लगा है ना बर्जर इजी क्लीन पेंट, नो दाग नो धब्बा, ओनली ब्यूटीफुल वॉल्स।
The stress of our world can take a toll on our physical and emotional health. Here, in New York's Catskill Mountains, lies a luxurious place of healing called WION Wellness Center. The WION Wellness Center provides 500,000 square feet of natural methods to manage diabetes, hypertension, chronic pain, obesity, depression, anxiety, and other conditions. We use the traditions of centuries-old natural science from India, yoga, Ayurveda, acupuncture, and naturopathy in personalized programs that help you take charge of your own health. A minimum 5-day stay is recommended for best results. Book now at yo1.com.
Stay connected with the world through WION. Like the page on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter for new alerts. Instagram for videos and images. And the website for the latest news, views, and analysis. WIOnews.com. World is one.
The stress of our world can take a toll on our physical and emotional health. Here, in New York's Catskill Mountains, lies a luxurious place of healing called WION Wellness Center. The WION Wellness Center provides 500,000 square feet of natural methods to manage diabetes, hypertension, chronic pain, obesity, depression, anxiety, and other conditions. We use the traditions of centuries-old natural science from India, yoga, Ayurveda, acupuncture, and naturopathy in personalized programs that help you take charge of your own health. A minimum 5-day stay is recommended for best results. Book now at WION.com.
Stay connected with the world through WION. Like the page on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter for new alerts. Instagram for videos and images. And the website for the latest news, views, and analysis. WIONews.com. World is one.
The stress of our world can take a toll on our physical and emotional health. Here, in New York's Catskill Mountains, lies a luxurious place of healing called WION Wellness Center. The WION Wellness Center provides 500,000 square feet of natural methods to manage diabetes, hypertension, chronic pain, obesity, depression, anxiety, and other conditions. We use the traditions of centuries-old natural science from India, yoga, Ayurveda, acupuncture, and naturopathy in personalized programs that help you take charge of your own health. A minimum 5-day stay is recommended for best results. Book now at WION.com.
Welcome. You're watching Pulse on WION with me, Neha Khanna. On the show, we have all the top news stories from around the globe for you, including the latest on the Russia-Ukraine war. Let's first take a look at the headlines we're tracking. Ukraine's military releases footage of its troops on the outskirts of Bakhmut, showing destroyed houses and conditions on the front line. Israeli forces kill 4 Palestinians, including at least 2 gunmen and a teenager during a raid in the occupied West Bank, say Palestinian medics. The Israeli police says its special forces shot 2 militants in Jenin. Hopes of an end to the doctors and nurses strike in the United Kingdom. Finally, staff have been offered a nearly 6% pay rise from April. The unions are recommending members back the deal. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken reached